attempt to free their country from foreign invaders, the Yugoslav Communist Partisans were often faced with shortages of war materiel, especially anti-tank weapons and tanks. Fortunately, after 1943, the Western Allies decided to send a variety of war materiel, including M3A1 and A3 Stuart light tanks. While these tanks were a welcome addition, their guns were quite inadequate for either anti-tank use or in assaulting fortified enemy positions. By the end of 1944, the Partisans resolved this issue by mounting captured German weapons, such as the 7.5 cm Pak-40 anti-tank gun and 2 cm Flakvierling 38 anti-aircraft guns on their Stuart tanks, creating some bizarre vehicles. Following the quick conquest of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia during the April War, its territories were divided between the victorious Axis forces. Due to the harsh and brutal occupation by the Axis troops, by the second half of 1941, two resistance groups, the Royalist Chetniks and Communist Partisans, started a rebellion against the occupiers. By the end of 1943, the Partisans were heavily involved in organizing attacks on the Germans and their allies, inflicting increasing losses in men and materiel. Initially, the Western Allies mainly supported the Chetnik movement, but this attitude changed drastically from 1943 onwards, as the Allies instead focused on supporting the ever-increasing partisan movement, supplying them with ammunition and equipment. This led to the agreement with the Allies to provide tanks and armored cars in order to create a partisan-operated tank brigade. This unit, named the 1st Tank Brigade, was officially formed on July 16, 1944. The British supplied some 56 M3A1 A3 tanks, 24 AEC Mark II armored cars, and 2 M3A1 scout cars. The 1st Tank Brigade would see extensive action against the Germans and their allies until the end of the war, but due to a high attrition rate, a great number of Stuart light tanks were either lost or heavily damaged. Given the general lack of replacements, these had to be repaired in order to keep the whole unit operational. Some damaged vehicles had their turrets removed and replaced with captured weapons. The brigade was transported by British ships to the island of Vis off the Yugoslav Adriatic coast in early September of 1944, with the operation successfully completed by October. On the 3rd of November, the Partisans managed to push the defending Germans out of the city of Šibenik, which prior to the war was a large naval shipyard and possessed a number of workshops. Despite many of them being sabotaged by the retreating Germans, there was still sufficient working equipment and materials left to meet the needs of the partisan mechanics, who were in great need of such tools. The fighting with the Germans had led to heavy tank losses, and as there was no way to replenish lost tanks, the Partisans were forced to try and salvage and repair damaged vehicles. Enemy vehicles and equipment captured by that time were also transported to Šibenik in the hope of repairing them, or if this was not possible, to be cannibalized for spare parts. By the end of 1944, at the La Dalmatian workshop in Šibenik, a number of Stuarts with damaged turrets were present. A decision was made by the partisan authorities stationed there to try and install a number of captured German weapons in hope of increasing their combat effectiveness. While a number of sources claim that 4 different such modifications were made based on the information and evidence available, 2 were armed with German 2 cm Flakvierling 38 anti-aircraft guns, and between 1 and 3 were armed with 7.5 cm Pak-40 anti-tank guns. Precisely how the Partisans mounted these 2 weapons on a Stuart tank is unknown due to lack of sources. If we take into account that tanks with increased firepower were in high demand, the Partisans would most likely have gone for the simplest working solution. For the Pak versions, it is probable that the Partisans first installed a reinforced base on which they mounted the gun with its cradle mount. In order to save weight and space, the Pak wheels and trailing legs were removed. The installation of the 2 cm anti-aircraft guns likely had a much simpler construction. Those were simply placed on top of the M3A3 superstructure and possibly connected by using bolts or simple welding. A problem noted with the flak-armed Stuarts was that the gun mount could hinder the hull-positioned crew from using their escape hatches. To resolve this, Partisans simply modified the 2 hatches, which now opened forwards. The Pak-armed version did not receive this modification. The secondary armament consisted of the original hull-mounted Browning 7.62mm machine gun, but some vehicles appear to lack this. The reason for this is unknown, but it was possibly done to make more room inside the vehicle, or they were simply removed for maintenance or ammunition reasons. In some photographs, a second Browning machine gun can be seen at the top of the gun shield or behind it. The capacity of the ammunition load that these vehicles had is unknown. In the case of the pack version, its ammunition load would be quite limited. The larger 75mm rounds were either stored inside the vehicle or in an auxiliary support vehicle. The flak version, due to its rate of fire of 1680 to 1920 RPM, needed huge amounts of ammunition in the form of 20-round magazines. The gun itself had a special ammunition box on its base on both sides, where up to 8 magazines could be stored within easy reach by the two loaders. This means that at least 320 rounds could be carried within the vehicle. Due to these magazines being relatively small, additional spares could be carried inside the vehicle or stored somewhere on the superstructure. These Stuart modifications did not receive any major changes regarding armor protection, and the whole armor remained the same. The crew that operated the main guns were only lightly protected. The pack versions, besides the gun shield, received improvised side armor plates made from salvaged German vehicles that were too damaged to be repaired. The crew of the flak version had to rely on the gun shield itself for protection. This meant that the gun operators were almost completely exposed to enemy return fire of nearly all calibers. Using this vehicle in close combat, such as in cities, would be very dangerous, especially since the top and the back of this fighting compartment were completely open. Depending on the main armament, these modified Stuarts had 4 to 5 crew members. In both cases, 2 crew members would be positioned inside, including the driver and his assistant. For the pack, at least 2 crew members would be needed on top, one to act as gunner and the second as a loader. The flak version needed 1 gunner and 2 loaders to operate the gun effectively. While the precise number of pack Stuarts built is not clear, there is a general consensus that 2 flak Stuarts were constructed by the Partisans. While there are a few photographs of them being used by them, if they actually saw combat is not clear. Besides a brief mention of the flak Stuarts near the city of Nin during November 1944, no written documents about their use is known. These 2 vehicles would survive the war. In June 1946, the 1st Tank Brigade handed these 2 vehicles over to the newly founded 1st Tank Division. They were used up to 1949, but their final fate is unknown, and they don't seem to have survived. Once the pack Stuarts were completed in late March, they were dispatched to the front line, but there is little precise information on their usage in action. It is known that they saw service during the liberation of cities like Mostar, Bihać, and Drenovaca during February and March of 1945, and at the end of April they were engaged in heavy fighting with the Germans near Ilirska Bistrica. In one engagement, the pack Stuart managed to destroy a German-operated T-34-76. Both versions participated in the final liberation of Trieste near the end of the war in May 1945. The precise fate of the pack Stuarts after the war is unclear. If they survived, they were not preserved and were likely scrapped. Allegedly, during the war, 2 more modified Stuarts were made, one armed with a mortar and one with a 15cm gun. In the case of the mortar-armed Stuart, it is a simple misidentification of a captured German Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251 half-track, armed with 2 12cm mortars. This vehicle was captured in early 1945 by the 1st Tank Brigade. The other alleged version consisted of German 15cm SIG guns mounted on top of the Stuart superstructure. Its existence is highly questionable, as there are only a few mentions in online sources. As the story goes, one was modified and lost in its first combat action. This modification was probably a fictional story, given the impracticality of the whole design, although worse chassis managed to carry the gun, such as the Panzer I. This concludes our look at the unusual Yugoslav partisan modifications of the Stuart tanks. What do you think about adding German guns on salvaged Stuarts? Would you like to learn more about this overlooked front of the Second World War? Let us know in the comments. If you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss a single video. If you want to contribute more directly, consider Patreon or PayPal. The money comes back to you in the form of bigger and better videos. Until next time, keep us in your sights.